March 1945, near the German border, an SS commander stood surrounded by armed men and laughed directly at an American ultimatum. General Patton had given him one final chance. Surrender. Release the prisoners. End it now. Instead, the commander smiled, folded the message, and tossed it onto a table as if it were a joke. The room erupted in laughter. Outside, cold rain hammered the rooftops. American artillery crews waited beside loaded guns. Engines rumbled in the darkness. Watches ticked toward a deadline only a handful of men knew about. The SS commander believed Patton was bluffing. He believed the Americans would negotiate. He believed he still held the advantage. He was wrong, because at that exact moment, less than a mile away, Patton was already putting a plan into motion that would turn confidence into panic in a matter of minutes. What happened next has never been fully told. Until now. If this kind of real history matters to you, the stories they never taught you in school, subscribe before we go any further. It costs nothing, and it tells us this work matters. March 22, 1945, 6:18 in the morning. The temperature hovered just above 38 degrees Fahrenheit near the town of Speyer, Germany. A cold rain had fallen through most of the night, turning roads into rivers of mud and filling shell craters with brown water that reflected the gray dawn sky. The war in Europe was entering its final months, but for thousands of men trapped behind German lines, the danger was far from over. Among them was Private First Class James Walker, 22 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, a rifleman with the U.S. Third Army. For 147 days, he had been in Europe. Inside the breast pocket of his field jacket, he carried a folded photograph of his wife, Margaret, standing beside the front porch of their small white house. 3 days earlier, he had written a letter home promising her that the war would soon be over. He never imagined what was about to happen. That same morning, scattered reports began reaching American headquarters. A group of captured Allied prisoners had disappeared near a heavily fortified German position, controlled by an SS commander known for refusing surrender demands. Witnesses described trucks arriving in darkness, prisoners being moved, gunfire heard in the distance, then silence. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, but experienced officers feared the worst. The unit responsible belonged to the Waffen-SS, the most fanatical branch of Hitler's military machine. Even as Germany collapsed around them, many SS commanders continued fighting with a level of fanaticism that shocked even regular German army officers. The commander in charge of this sector had built a reputation throughout the war. He believed fear was a weapon. He believed mercy was weakness. And he believed the Americans lacked the will to do what was necessary. Those beliefs would soon collide with General George Patton. At Third Army headquarters, maps covered entire walls. Telephones rang constantly. Staff officers moved between briefing rooms carrying intelligence reports stained with mud and rain. Patton understood something many people did not. Every dot on those maps represented real men. Men like James Walker. Men carrying photographs. Men writing letters home. Men who expected their commanders to bring them back alive. Patton had already lost thousands of soldiers during the campaign across France and Germany. Every casualty report landed heavily on his desk, and every report involving prisoners triggered immediate attention. Because if captured American soldiers were being executed rather than held, the rules of war themselves were beginning to collapse. And that changed everything. Outside, artillery thunder rolled across the countryside. The smell of wet earth mixed with diesel exhaust. Church bells echoed from distant villages. And somewhere behind German lines, terrified prisoners waited for a fate they could not control. What James Walker did not know yet was that the reports reaching Patton's headquarters were only part of the story. And by the time he found out, it was already too late to stop what was coming. March 22, 1945, 8:41 in the morning. The rain had stopped, but low clouds still hung over the German countryside like a gray ceiling. Water dripped from damaged rooftops. Smoke rose from chimneys and shell craters alike. The air smelled of wet earth, coal, and burned fuel. Inside a stone headquarters building near Speyer, the SS commander reviewed the latest reports. His name was Obersturmbannführer Karl Weiss, 41 years old, a veteran Nazi party member, a decorated Waffen-SS officer. For nearly a decade, Weiss had climbed the ranks by doing exactly what the regime wanted, crushing resistance, enforcing terror, and carrying out orders without hesitation. In occupied Eastern Europe, his unit had been linked to civilian executions and anti-partisan operations that left entire villages destroyed. Instead of punishment, he received promotions. Instead of investigation, he received medals. The more ruthless he became, the more valuable he appeared to the collapsing Nazi leadership. Now, as Allied armies closed in from every direction, Weiss remained convinced that fear could still win battles. That morning, an American messenger under a white flag arrived with a written demand. Surrender. Release all Allied prisoners. Avoid destruction. The message carried Patton's authority. Weiss read every word. Then he laughed. One officer shifted uneasily. "Sir," he said, "the Americans are advancing faster than expected." Weiss waved him off. "They advance because we allow it." Another officer pointed toward a map. "Our western defenses are weakening." Weiss smirked. "Then tell the men to stop weakening." Several officers exchanged nervous glances. Nobody else laughed. They understood the situation better than their commander did. By noon, additional intelligence reached 3rd Army headquarters. The news was worse than anyone expected. A reconnaissance team reported evidence that Allied prisoners had been separated from regular POW groups and transferred to a secure compound under SS control. No official records, no prisoner lists, no explanation, just men disappearing. Patton listened quietly as the briefing unfolded. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood beside a map table with both hands resting on its edge. The room grew silent. One intelligence officer finally asked, "General, do you believe they're holding them as bargaining chips?" Patton looked at the report, then at the map, then back at the officer. "I think they're running out of time." That answer unsettled everyone in the room, because it suggested Patton feared something far worse. At 1:17 in the afternoon, another report arrived. This one came from local civilians. Witnesses claimed they had heard sustained gunfire near a wooded area east of the compound during the previous night. Not a firefight, not artillery, execution-style bursts. The room went silent. One captain slowly removed his glasses. Another stared at the floor. For 11 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was rainwater dripping from a damaged gutter outside the headquarters window. Patton read the report once, then again. Then he folded it carefully. What happened next, one officer later remembered, was when the atmosphere changed completely. Patton was no longer gathering information. He was making calculations. Distances, travel times, available units, artillery positions, deadlines, and somewhere inside the German headquarters, Karl Weiss still believed he controlled the situation. He believed Patton would negotiate. He believed the prisoners gave him leverage. He believed the ultimatum was a bluff. What Weiss did not know was that a second message was already on its way. And unlike the first one, this message carried a deadline. March 22, 1945, 4:03 in the afternoon. The clouds had finally begun to break apart above the Rhine Valley. Weak sunlight slipped through the gray sky and reflected off puddles scattered across muddy roads. The temperature had climbed to 46 degrees, but the wind remained cold enough to sting exposed skin. At 3rd Army headquarters, a military jeep skidded to a stop outside the command building. The driver jumped out before the vehicle had fully settled. He carried a sealed intelligence packet marked urgent. Inside were photographs, aerial reconnaissance photographs. Patton studied them in silence. The images showed fresh earth disturbances in a wooded clearing east of the SS compound. Several long trenches, fresh vehicle tracks, recently disturbed soil. The evidence was impossible to ignore. One intelligence officer swallowed hard. "General," Patton raised a hand. The officer stopped talking. Nobody wanted to say the words aloud. Everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. Mass graves. The atmosphere changed instantly. The casual movement inside headquarters vanished. Typewriters slowed. Conversations stopped. Maps were pulled from walls and spread across tables. The clock seemed louder. Every second mattered now. At 4:21 p.m., Patton issued a direct order. A final ultimatum would be delivered. The SS commander would have exactly 30 minutes. Release every Allied prisoner. Allow inspection of the compound. Surrender immediately, or face destruction. No extensions. No negotiations. No excuses. The messenger departed under a white flag, and for the first time that day, Karl Weiss faced a choice. Unfortunately for him, arrogance had already made the decision. The ultimatum arrived at 4:47 p.m. Weiss read it while standing beside a large oak table covered with military maps. Several officers watched nervously. One finally spoke. "Sir, perhaps we should consider their terms." Weiss looked up slowly. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. "Consider surrender." The officer hesitated. "The situation is changing." Weiss slammed the document onto the table. "The Americans want us frightened." Another officer stepped forward. "Our ammunition reserves are falling. We still have enough. They have tanks. We have courage." The room fell silent. Nobody believed that answer, but nobody challenged him again. Then Weiss made the mistake that would define the rest of his life. He ordered the ultimatum rejected. Not ignored, rejected. Formally, deliberately, and with witnesses present. The response was sent back immediately. At 5:12 p.m., the message reached Patton. An aide handed it over. Patton read it without expression. Then he placed it on the table. No anger, no dramatic speech, no shouting, just silence, a dangerous silence. For 14 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the ticking of a wall clock and the distant rumble of artillery from the eastern horizon. Patton's face revealed nothing, but those who knew him recognized the look. The decision had already been made. One colonel finally asked, "General, what are your orders?" Patton reached for a pencil. He circled the compound's position on the map. Then he looked directly at the officers gathered around him. "Proceed." One word. That was all. Telephones immediately came alive. Artillery units received coordinates. Tank commanders received movement orders. Infantry battalions began preparing for an assault. The machine had started moving, and it would not stop. Meanwhile, inside the compound, Karl Weiss celebrated. He believed he had stood up to one of America's most feared generals. He believed Patton would hesitate. He believed the Americans still needed him alive. As darkness began settling across the countryside, he even raised a glass with several officers. The laughter returned. The confidence returned. The illusion returned. But less than 2 miles away, hundreds of American guns were already turning toward their targets. And at exactly 5:30 p.m., the first order reached the artillery batteries. The command every soldier had been waiting for. Fire. What happened next would leave witnesses talking about that night for the rest of their lives. March 22, 1945, 5:30 in the evening. The first American artillery shell struck less than 50 yards from the SS compound. The explosion shattered windows across the headquarters building. A second shell landed seconds later. Then a third, and a fourth. Within moments, the entire horizon erupted in fire. The laughter inside Karl Weiss's headquarters vanished. Men who had been smiling moments earlier were now diving for cover as dust, glass, and chunks of masonry rained from the ceiling. Outside, American artillery batteries unleashed a carefully planned bombardment that shook the ground beneath every building in the area. The smell of smoke filled the air. Telephone lines went dead. Vehicles burned. The illusion of control disappeared. "Vast, get me headquarters," Weiss shouted. A radio operator looked up nervously. "The signal is gone, sir." "Then restore it." "We can't." Another blast rocked the building. The lights flickered. An officer wiped blood from his forehead. "We should surrender." Weiss turned toward him. "No." The officer stared back. "The Americans are already surrounding us." "No." "Our defenses are collapsing." "No." The answer never changed. Outside, tanks from the Third Army pushed through the outer defensive positions with terrifying speed. American infantry followed close behind. Resistance crumbled. Strongpoints disappeared one by one. At 6:11 p.m., white flags began appearing across sections of the German line. Not because they had been ordered, because soldiers understood the battle was over. But Weiss still refused. At 6:24 p.m., American forces breached the compound perimeter. Gunfire echoed through narrow streets. Orders were shouted. Boots pounded against wet pavement. Within minutes, the headquarters building was surrounded. The end had arrived. At 6:39 p.m., Karl Weiss was escorted into a temporary command post established inside a damaged municipal building. The room smelled of wet uniforms, cigarette smoke, and plaster dust. A single lantern cast long shadows across the walls. Several American officers stood silently. Then General Patton entered. Weiss expected anger. He expected threats. He expected shouting. Instead, Patton calmly removed his gloves and placed them on a table. The room became silent. Weiss forced a smile. "So," he said, "your ultimatum finally worked." Nobody laughed. Patton simply looked at him. For 12 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was rain tapping against broken glass. Weiss leaned back in his chair. "You Americans always arrive late." Patton said nothing. "You threaten much." Silence. "You destroy much." Silence. Then Weiss smirked. "But in the end, you still need men like me." Several officers exchanged looks. The arrogance was unbelievable. Patton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something so quiet that an officer standing nearby had to ask him to repeat it. He repeated it. Every person in that room remembered those exact words for the rest of their lives. "You made one mistake." Weiss frowned. Patton continued. "You thought time was working for you." The room froze. Then an intelligence officer entered carrying newly recovered documents from the compound. His face had gone pale. "What is it?" someone asked. The officer swallowed. "We found the prisoner records." Patton looked up. "So?" The officer hesitated. Then he answered, "The prisoners aren't all dead." For the first time that day, every person in the room was shocked, because what those records revealed was even worse than anyone had imagined. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. Should Patton have gone further, or did he cross a line? Tell us below. What happened next would uncover a secret hidden for months, and it would change the entire case against Karl Weiss. March 24, 1945. 2 days after the compound fell, a cold fog covered the countryside outside Speyer. Visibility dropped below 200 yards. Water dripped from pine branches. Mud clung to boots. Military police guarded every entrance to the former SS headquarters. Inside, investigators worked around the clock. The documents recovered from Weiss's compound had changed everything. The missing prisoners were not all dead. Some had been executed. Others had been secretly transferred between locations as American forces advanced, and dozens remained unaccounted for. The records contained names, dates, orders, signatures, including Karl Weiss's. What had begun as a battlefield surrender was rapidly becoming a war crimes investigation. But justice in wartime was never simple. Several intelligence officers wanted Weiss questioned immediately. Others argued he might possess valuable information about remaining German units. Political pressure arrived from multiple directions. Army lawyers wanted evidence secured. Counterintelligence officers wanted information first. Commanders wanted answers now. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried consequences. Meanwhile, investigators began locating survivors. One of them was Private First Class James Walker, the same 22-year-old rifleman from Columbus, Ohio. The man with the photograph of Margaret in his pocket. The man who had vanished from official reports. He was alive. Barely. American troops discovered him and several other prisoners in a concealed storage facility listed in Weiss's records under a false designation. Walker had lost nearly 30 pounds. His uniform hung loosely from his frame. His hands shook when he tried to drink water, but he remembered everything. When military investigators interviewed him, the room remained silent. Walker spoke slowly, carefully. Every sentence mattered. They separated us. He paused. They took names. Another pause. Then they started taking men away. The investigator looked up. Did they come back? Walker stared at the table. No. Nobody in the room asked another question for several seconds. The meaning was obvious. Those missing prisoners had never returned. Their names would later appear in evidence files. Their stories would help build the case. And the case grew rapidly. Witness statements, captured orders, recovered records, survivor testimony. By early April, military prosecutors believed they had enough evidence. Carl Weiss was formally charged. The announcement spread quickly. Some soldiers celebrated. Others remained skeptical, because everyone had seen important men escape consequences before. The proceedings moved forward anyway. Then came the verdict. He was found guilty. The sentence was death. Many believed the story was over. It wasn't. Behind closed doors, arguments erupted. Intelligence officials still wanted access to Weiss. Certain investigators believed additional information could be extracted. Others insisted the sentence should be carried out immediately. Justice collided with strategy, and strategy often won. When news reached Patton, witnesses described a rare moment of visible frustration. Not public frustration, private frustration, the kind shown only around trusted officers. One aide later recalled Patton standing alone beside a window after receiving the update. Outside, rain struck the glass. Inside, Patton remained silent for nearly a minute. Then he spoke. "If you delay justice long enough," he said quietly, "someone always finds a reason to delay it again." No one answered, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Weeks passed. The sentence remained. The guilty verdict remained. But the execution date kept moving. One postponement, then another's, then another's. And far from the headlines, powerful people were beginning to make decisions that would change everything. Carl Weiss had been convicted. Carl Weiss had been sentenced. But what happened next would leave survivors wondering whether justice had ever truly arrived at all. Summer 1946. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. Entire city blocks remained piles of broken brick and twisted steel. Weeds pushed through bomb craters. Burned-out vehicles rusted beside roads that had once carried armies. Most people believed the story of Carl Weiss had already ended. They were wronged. Inside government offices across occupied Germany, a different battle had begun. Not a military battle, a political one. The evidence against Weiss remained overwhelming. Witnesses had testified. Documents had been recovered. A military court had delivered its verdict. The sentence was clear, yet somehow Carl Weiss remained alive. Months passed, then more months. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies reviewed lists of former German officers. Information had become a valuable currency in the early days of the growing Cold War. Suddenly, some officials saw men like Weiss differently, not as convicted war criminals, as potential sources, potential assets, potential bargaining chips. The machinery of politics had begun to turn, and once it started moving, ordinary soldiers had very little influence over where it stopped. The delays continued. The appeals continued. The paperwork continued. For survivors, every delay felt like another betrayal, especially for men like James Walker. Back in Ohio, Walker was trying to rebuild his life. He married Margaret as planned. He found work. He smiled in photographs, but people who knew him noticed changes. He slept lightly. He disliked crowded rooms, and he almost never spoke about what happened in Germany. When he did, he spoke about the men who never came home, the names others had forgotten, the faces he still remembered. Some nights he would sit alone on the porch long after midnight. Not because he enjoyed the silence, because the silence reminded him who was missing. Meanwhile, Karl Weiss waited. Years passed. The sentence remained technically intact, but the certainty behind it faded. Then came the final twist. Not freedom, not complete punishment, something in between. Weiss spent years moving through a maze of detention facilities, reviews, and legal proceedings. His power vanished, his rank vanished, his reputation vanished. But many survivors believed he escaped the full consequences of what he had done. That belief never disappeared. In 1954, Weiss was transferred to a prison facility in southern Germany, a gray concrete complex surrounded by wire fences and watchtowers. The irony was impossible to miss. The man who had once controlled prisoners now spent his days counting steps inside a cell. The man who had laughed at surrender orders now waited for guards to tell him when he could eat, walk, or sleep. His final years were quiet. No speeches, no followers, no glory, only time. Lots of time. According to later accounts, he died largely forgotten. Not on a battlefield, not in triumph, not in front of cheering crowds, but in a narrow room with a single window overlooking a prison yard. Rain tapped softly against the glass. A guard signed a report, and that was it. Yet even then, the story refused to end cleanly, because one question remained unresolved. How many prisoners disappeared before the compound fell? The records recovered by American investigators answered many questions. Not all of them. Some names were never matched to graves. Some families never received complete answers. And some files remained incomplete. James Walker carried that uncertainty for the rest of his life. He survived. Many others did not. And every Memorial Day, he returned to a small monument honoring local veterans. Not to remember the war, to remember the men who never got the chance to leave it. The case was closed. The verdict was recorded. The prison cell was empty, but the unanswered questions never disappeared, and neither did the lessons Patton took from what happened. Spring 1947. The grass had begun returning to the battlefields of Europe. Shell craters were filling with rainwater and wildflowers. Damaged roads were being rebuilt. New families moved into towns that only a few years earlier had stood directly in the path of armies. The war was over, but its questions remained. General George Patton never believed victory alone was enough. Winning battles mattered. Defeating dictators mattered. But Patton understood something many leaders overlooked. A battlefield victory meant very little if the rules that separated soldiers from murderers disappeared along the way. That was what made cases like Karl Weiss so important. Not because Weiss was unique, because he wasn't. History had produced many men willing to hide behind uniforms, ranks, and ideology. Patton understood that the real danger came when such men convinced themselves they would never face consequences. That arrogance was exactly what Patton saw the day Weiss laughed at the ultimatum. He wasn't looking at confidence. He was looking at a man who believed accountability no longer applied to him. And that belief had already destroyed countless lives. What happened next became part of a larger lesson carried forward by military officers, investigators, and historians for decades. The idea that even during war, limits matter. Even during chaos, rules matter. Even during victory, justice matters. Yet history rarely provides perfect endings. Karl Weiss was punished, but many believed he was not punished enough. The prisoners were found, but not all of them. The evidence was collected, but some questions remained unanswered. That uncomfortable reality is part of what makes the story endure. Today, visitors can still stand in former battle areas along the Rhine Valley and see traces of the conflict. Old bunkers, weathered memorials, rows of military graves, quiet places where history feels closer than expected. And standing in those places forces a difficult question. What happens when power is allowed to operate without limits? It is the same question soldiers faced in 1945, and it remains relevant today. The same question Patton faced in 1945 is being asked today in conflicts around the world. The rules he fought to enforce are the same rules being debated right now. How should prisoners be treated? Where is the line between military necessity and criminal behavior? What happens when leaders ignore that line? Those debates continue because human nature has not changed. The uniforms change. The technology changes. The battlefields change. The questions remain. Perhaps that is why stories like this survive long after the guns fall silent. Not because they give easy answers, because they refuse to. At a veterans memorial in Columbus, Ohio, visitors sometimes stop to read names engraved into cold stone. Most pass by in only a few seconds, but every name represents an entire life. A family, a future, a story. James Walker understood that better than most. He lived long enough to see the war become history, long enough to watch new generations learn about events he had actually witnessed. Yet when friends asked what he remembered most, it wasn't the artillery. It wasn't the surrender. It wasn't even Carl Weiss. It was the men who never came home, the men whose names grew harder to remember with each passing year. And perhaps that is the final truth of this story. Not the fate of a commander, not the decision of a general, but the cost paid by ordinary soldiers caught in the middle of history. If this story stayed with you, share it with one person who loves history. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and drop a comment telling us which part hit hardest. We read every single one.